One of the biggest missed opportunities in Ace Attorney's main series is, to me, the disinterest and disregard for the jury system. Not the one introduced in The Great Ace Attorney, but the one for the main series. It felt like Apollo Justice was an overt critique of how this system had worked previously, paving the way for something new. Given that this was Ace Attorney's debut game on new hardware, it feels appropriate that these games would take a second to examine themselves on a meta level and rethink the way things work. It was an opportunity to reinvigorate and redesign Ace Attorney in a way that addresses some of its problems. The immediate response to this, again, is, well, that's just The Great Ace Attorney. But anyone that's heard me speak about the game knows that that's not the ideal system for Ace Attorney to adhere to, at least to me. But to understand how I think the system could be implemented, we first have to understand what's wrong with how The Great Ace Attorney did it. The system introduced in The Great Ace Attorney is simple. There are 6 jurors with all unique designs. They can interrupt the trial at any time to declare the defendant guilty. Specifically guilty, because that's all they do. Then you get a summation examination where you find contradictions between the jurors' statements. There are so many issues with this system. First of all, let's talk about comparing the jurors' statements with an example. Let's say juror number 1 says, the defendant used a knife. And juror number 2 says, the defendant used their bare hands. In The Great Ace Attorney, you'd compare both these statements with each other, and both parties would change their verdict to innocent. When I describe it like this, do you see what the immediate issue is? Why does it matter that juror 1 and juror 2 have 2 different ideas of how the crime took place? Why should they be unanimous in how they understand the crime? And number 2, and this is important, why does this make their verdict change back to innocent? We're not proving anything. We're going, hey, do you see what he said? You're gonna take that? Is that what you're gonna do? After you said all of that with chest, is that what you're gonna, like, do you see how this doesn't make much sense? When you think about it, it doesn't do anything. And in my opinion, it makes the system much more uninteresting. The second issue is that the jury doesn't function as a jury as much as they are additional witnesses. In case 4, one of the jurors is walking on the road the night of the crime. In case 5, you have the stereoscopic guy, and here he is in all of his contrived glory. In case 2 of the second game, the person that owns the gas company exposes the witness for committing fraud. And in case 3, the one about magic and tricks and scientists, there is a literal magician and scientist on the stand. It's cute once or twice, but when the entire twist hinges on the existence of a convenient jury member, it completely cheapens any sense of the case unraveling organically. But also, it doesn't even let the system function as intended, because more often than not, I'm pressing the statement of the guy being vague because I know they have something to do with the crime. And at that point, you're just a witness. Finally, and this will be my final point on this, and I know it's a bit of a controversial one, I really don't like that they can interrupt the trial whenever they want. And I don't mean that in terms of speaking, I mean that in terms of guilty, guilty, guilty. I know it's supposed to add to the stakes, but does it? At its best, it's an arbitrary brick wall that the game puts on your progression at random points in the trial. But at its absolute worst, it's an excuse for the CEO of the crime scene to tell you exactly what happened. Regardless of what it does, I'm left unsatisfied. Now you know how I feel, let's start thinking about how we fix it. In the description of this video, I designed a concept trial to communicate how I think the jury system could work. It's not complete and it's a relatively easy case, not much thought put into it, but the idea is to show how this could theoretically function. So you can actually play this concept if this video doesn't really convince you of anything. The first issue I want to remedy is the idea of the jurors having different stances and that being a problem. Instead of looking at these as contradictions, I think it should be embraced. If the jurors are functionally just different judges for the trial, then you should have to prove different things to them. Each juror should have a stance that they commit to at the beginning of the trial, and you spend the remainder of the case trying to disprove them. This actually does a few things. One, it makes your goals and intentions throughout the trial very clear. What will actually get your client an acquittal? And 2, it gets rid of the guilty interruptions. You'll know you're making progress by how you slowly dismantle and knock down the jurors and their arguments. You could even have a health bar system similar to the player, where it visually indicates how close you are. Part of the appeal of this system is comparing different stances, and that's something I do understand. So I think to keep with this theme, you should always be able to compare statements from testimony to the jurors' stances. Think multi-witness testimonies in The Great Ace Attorney or Professor Layton vs Ace Attorney. I haven't really beaten that last one, so And just throwing that example out there, I wouldn't be able to comment on that. Instead of being a glorified audio cue, it would require the player to pay attention to the testimony and if it lines up with the juror's stance. This way, the system is functionally the same, but it breaks the pace significantly less. This is how I would introduce the juror system into Ace Attorney. And while I don't think my idea or execution is perfect, I'm a little fatigued of the current system to begin with, and I can only hope this would help refine it. I'm always cautious when I make these "this is how I would do it" videos, because I recognize how arrogant it is. If I can even speak to the process of even creating that case, I learned a lot even with its flaws. I understand that while pressing is a very boring mechanic and I don't think it's used very well, I understand why it's there. You're limited to 5 or 6 statements if you're lucky, and if a contradiction is straightforward to find, then it limits the sense of struggle and discovery. I recognize why Ace Attorney hides certain pieces of evidence. Revealing a new one can make you rethink a testimony or case entirely, and to be blunt, it's also really difficult sometimes. There was a comment I got on my Twitter that really stuck out to me, and it really made me rethink what I was doing. They said that my system allowed for less drama, and that's kind of part of the appeal. And above all else, I understand it. For all the talk I have about this series and its mechanics, to argue the drama serves no purpose would be disingenuous. One of my favorite moments in Turnabout Succession is where Vera poisons herself on the stand, and when you save her, Phoenix implies it's because you gave her something worth living for. I remember playing Farewell My Turnabout and seeing Francisca run in with 3 different pieces of evidence and getting really excited. I remember Phoenix being desperate in Turnabout Goodbyes and calling the parrot to the stand, and you're kind of there like, no way he's gonna do this, right? There's no way he's gonna make any sense. He's not gonna do this, right? Bro, I remember crying my eyes out when I finished Trials and Tribulations. Like, it's so easy to be pedantic and excruciate all of these details all the time, but I am not so jaded, I am not so distant to this feeling that I don't remember or understand. These are very real and sincere and earnest attachments that I think we have to these moment-to-moment set pieces, and even these characters. Ace Attorney is a courtroom drama, and no matter how much I invest myself in how these games are designed, I will never forget this. I can't. I fell in love with Ace Attorney for 2 reasons. 1, because I love solving puzzles, and eventually because I loved the story and the characters. And neither one of those is more important than the other. But oftentimes it feels like this series, and by extension its fandom, tend to lead more to one side than the other. And I think if this series truly wishes to improve, it needs to learn to balance these things better. Because both have a place in Ace Attorney, but one cannot exist without the other.